Welcome to Recross the Paths. My name is Cade. And my guest today is Haiyue. Welcome. Haiyue, I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Kate. I'm excited to be here.
Haiyue, you have a broad background in all sorts of things from esports casting, competitive magic playing, cube design. You've covered a lot of bases.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy a large part of magic, and I think the things that I enjoy about magic can be found in a lot of different areas, most of which involve 40 cards.
Fair enough. Fair enough. What do you find yourself most excited about right now in the magic space?
I am looking forward to Ether Drift. I think that it's a very cool concept for a set, and I kind of like racing things. And I'm maybe this is a little bit of controversial straight out the bat, but I'm kind of a sucker for like the plays on various things, like the new takes on things like Space Jace, or the Cowboys, or the techno neo cyberpunk kind of stuff. Like I really like the trend that they're doing.
Absolutely. Well, then you get all sorts of options here in the next few years, it sounds like.
Yeah, certainly a lot to look forward to.
So you said 40 cards is kind of a focus for you. Give us a little bit of background as to your history with Magic and perhaps how you found your way into Cube.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I started out playing limited, and I've always loved limited. I think it's just very magical to me that you can turn up and everybody is on the same level. Like all the players in your pod or everyone in your sealed event are starting out at the same place. It's not pay to win, it's just who can draft the best or who can build the pool the best. And it's really kind of very decision intensive, very skill intensive. And I just think that limited is the best way to play Magic. And then getting into Cube. Oh, my friend Ryan Overturf always calls retail limited scathingly, but I played a lot of retail limited when I first started out, and that's still, I think, my favorite way to play. And then getting into Cube a bit more recently, maybe in the last few years or so, it's just seeing the kind of creativity of people in the Cube community is really mind blowing, I think.
So it sounds like a large part of your experience these days is also on the casting side of helping commentate matches and events. How did you find your way into doing that?
Yeah, that is. I get asked this a lot, and a lot of people also contact me saying, they would like to give casting a try, and try to figure out how to get into it. And first of all, if that is you or anyone of your listeners, I would highly encourage giving it a go. But the first time I actually jumped in the booth, I was at this weird esports magic event that was in person. So it was like in this physical esports arena, which was essentially like a glorified warehouse with a bunch of computers in it.
Perfect.
And my friend Mani, who is now on the Pro Tour broadcasts, he was running this esports event and he was casting it. This was several years ago. This was pre pandemic, and I lost very early in this event. I think I like crashed out in round three or something. And then he said, "Do you want to try jumping in the booth?" And I thought, okay, why not? And
Oh,
so I just
just like
jumped in the
that.
booth with him. Yeah, just straight away, just jumped in the booth with him and had a great time. And then it really took off from there. The early days were very scrappy. And I think if anyone's trying to do this, like it's really the only way. So it did a lot of small events for kind of local game stores even, or there was this series called like the Mythic Society series, and it was like you would do like a 4-hour shift for $60 in store credit or whatever it is. um, but then once you've done a little bit, you can kind of build up a show reel, and then it's really just putting it in front of people and trying to find a way in wherever you can. I was pretty lucky, I think, that quote unquote pretty lucky, because I was kind of starting out during the kind of early pandemic, and when all the events went online, there was this big wave of especially Channel Fireball was doing a lot of events back to back, and they were called the CFB Clash series or something. I honestly, it's that time was such a blur to everyone, but they were doing all these events pretty much every other weekend or every few weekends, and they were attempting to try and replicate the GP experience online. So, they were like very long events, and they needed a bunch of people to cast them. and they were kind of just letting pretty much anyone have a go. Yeah, I mean that's maybe an exaggeration, but because they had so many shows and so many slots, it was pretty easy to kind of talk them into giving you a go. So Mani and I said yes to a lot of things, and we also said yes to a lot of shows that were like European time zone tournaments, which was for us like 2 to 6 a.m.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness.
on Pacific time. And the two of us, we both live in Vancouver, and we were just, taking these shows just to try and get as many hours in the booth as possible, basically.
Oh, that has to be such a wild experience with so much of it being remote too, especially like in those later like years during the pandemic.
Yeah, and actually, most of the shows I've done have been remote. So it's a very interesting thing where you're kind of just sitting at home in front of your computer talking to your webcam, and there's, I don't know, several thousand people watching on the other side. But you don't ever see them, so it's fine. They don't exist. They can't hurt you.
They're yeah, or it's just you and I talking in the microphone. That's it. Is that tough to maintain excitement in that kind of setting?
It can be a little bit tough. I think that it really depends a lot on what is being played. So the arena events, I think, have been easier to keep the pace high, the energy high, because arena is a bit more fast paced generally. Like with the when you take game actions, things happen. There's
Yeah.
animations and um,
The paper magic, they haven't quite worked out the pyrotechnics yet.
right, exactly. When Uro comes like through the ceiling or whatever it is in the next portal, like that would be something you've witnessed. But the
We need to talk to Brian Kibler's stunt coordinator.
I would love that. Yeah, so arena's a bit easier. I think some of the hardest events to keep that energy up is Magic Online. So I did a lot of kind of the Magic Online Champions Showcase series a few years ago, and it was great because there was Vintage Cube. That was the best
Yeah.
part of it.
Oh yeah.
Competitive Vintage Cube, where you win a Worlds invite, is just insane. Like that is the wildest part of Vintage Cube you can imagine.
Yeah, all of a sudden there are stakes for it. It's not just can I play the deck I enjoy or can I force the thing I like. It's we're trying to win.
Right. And like those players, the one I always really remember is JMM, Yamaritz Merkel, pack one, pick one Blade Splicer in in the Magic Online Champions Showcase. And it was just so
Amazing.
the opposite of what, you and I might log on to Magic Online to jam.
I might pick a Blade Splicer, but yeah, there are a lot of a lot of directions to go there.
Right. I mean, it's just one of those things, where everyone has their take on how to actually win the most number of games in a format like Vintage Cube. And it was clear that he just came in with a game plan. I don't play Vintage Cube like that. When I log on to Magic Online, I am not passing the card into, you know, ever.
I mean, honestly, it's up there. I don't know how you would.
Right.
Most recently, I got to see some of your work at CubeCon. So you got to see a lot of cubes, not just the vintage cube. They're in the finals, but a whole smattering of different cubes. Had you done anything like that before?
No, CubeCon actually was a lot of different firsts for me. It was actually the first time that I was flown out to an event to do casting kind of physically on site, which was very cool. It felt very, very different to doing it at home,
Oh yeah.
sitting in front of the webcam. And we, I think, put together some very, very cool rounds. The cubes that we managed to show were very unique. And, sometime before the event, they gave us a list of potential cubes for coverage. And we actually got to kind of look through those lists and see what we might want to cover. And I think it was pretty great because Ryan and I both chose the same cubes, the same top five. Like we didn't consult with each other and we
Oh,
just
that's
chose the
awesome.
same top five, which was pretty sweet. Yeah.
I do like the idea that you all got to draft the cubes that you got to cover in a way.
It's draft all the way down. I really loved some of the cubes that we got to do. Yeah.
So you got lists ahead of time. Did it feel like you were doing research to feel like you could adequately engage with those?
Yeah, for sure. I think something that I was a bit worried about before going in is just knowing all the cards. Like if you're playing a cube and you don't know all the cards, it's fine, right? You're drafting, you're making one decision at a time. But when you're doing coverage, normally you get a lot of preparation. Like if I'm covering standard, I'm going to know every card in every deck in standard. That's not a huge card pool
Right.
to know. Or if it's just the vintage cube at the Magic Online Champions Showcase, then it's I have the list, I can make sure I know. But when we're covering, I don't know, 5 or 6 different cubes over a weekend, and each cube is several hundred cards, especially being play by play, like just wanting to make sure that I knew the cards and could recognize them, played in paper with the
Yeah.
glare of cameras, and such. So that was definitely a challenge for KubeCon, but I think ultimately it went pretty smoothly, and yeah, it was really cool getting to see the event, the cubes beforehand. But actually, something that was interesting was that the cubes that we wanted to show, we did show, but the cubes that we thought maybe would be the best for coverage weren't necessarily the best for coverage.
Interesting. Like what comes to mind when you describe that?
The one that comes to mind is 100 ornithopters. I love 100 ornithopters. I just, to put that out there, I'm sure your listeners in the cube community, know of it, or probably have played it.
Many hearts have been stolen by these 100 strange flying machines.
Indeed. And so I think that was Ryan and I both picked that as the single cube that we wanted to cover the most. And then when it came down to the draft, it was great. The draft was incredible. It was very, very funny. We got to riff a lot on all the different ornithopters and which ornithopter is better, and how could
Because they're
this
all
still
numbered. Yeah.
right? How could this still be in the pack? That kind of thing. but then, but then it came down to the games, and then we realized, wow, like a lot of the cards in this cube affect all the ornithopters, right? Like, so in terms of the actual gameplay, a lot of the time, like a deck can just completely take over a game very, very quickly. And sometimes there's not a lot of back and forth, right? Like if you have a thing that just, I don't know, kills all of your opponent's ornithopters, it's very difficult as a deck sometimes to come back from that. There are obviously cards that can do that, but the games tend to not play out in that very back and forth way that makes it easier for coverage to kind of make it exciting, if that makes sense.
Yeah, not quite edge of your seat the way that some other environments might be.
Right. And also
I mean, still
some
fun, still
decks, yeah, it
interesting.
was great. Very interesting, very fun. Some people did just draft decks that didn't work also. That was
Yeah.
another problem, I think. And it makes sense. Like if I've never seen 100 Ornithopters before and I'm just drafting it for the first time, I do not rate my chances of being able to make a functional deck very highly.
Yeah, you can't just draft ornithopters and win. You have to, there's something else to that.
Right, right. But, I think that overall, definitely no regrets showing 100 Ornithopters. I think it was incredible. I think it was 100%, 100% right
Yeah, of
to
course, of course.
to um to kind of showcase how innovative it was and how cool it was. And I know that the players had a great time, for sure.
Absolutely. I think that's maybe a good way to talk about something that I heard you say on another interview. I believe it was with Casual Magic. You use the phrase emotional cadence when talking about casting. Can
Hmm.
you unpack that idea a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that for casters, I see our role as the conduit, between the audience, who's made up mostly of people who engage with magic on a much more casual level than most people who ever play in a tournament, or people like us who quote unquote work in magic, right? Like the amount that we engage with the game is extremely, extremely high. And the amount that most people who are watching a tournament engage with the game is way lower. And so when you're casting, I think a lot of the time people who are more entrenched players who are more engaged, they're watching and they're maybe watching for tips on how to get better, or how did this person win, or how did they outplay their opponent, and that kind of high level strategy stuff, or the tactics, or the technical play. And that stuff is all very cool. Like that stuff is great. And for me as a play-by-play caster, like my role is kind of keep it going and get all of that information out of my co-caster, like out of my expert. But a lot of the time, I think that Magic, like all other games, there are these incredible high points and low points. And when you're playing Magic, the thing that we love, I think, about playing Magic is those high and low points. I mean, we don't love the low points, but they are an essential part of the game. And afterwards, if you go and listen to how players, after a round of Magic at any event, when they go to their friends and they talk about what happened, sometimes, yes, they're going to talk about the technical play and blah, 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 blah. But a lot of the time they're gonna be like, oh, but I was really on the back foot and I thought I was gonna lose, but then I top decked this incredible card and that was the thing that made the difference. Or alternatively, on the other side of it, oh, it was so awful. Like I just sat there and I flooded out and I just thought I only need this one thing, but I couldn't get it. And that like those emotions are what drives us back to this game time and time again. So for me, when I'm casting, I think it's pretty important for me to bring out like those points in a game, especially in something like online Magic, where it's a little bit less personal. You often don't get to see the players very much, and but those emotions are still there. They're just kind of hidden, and so I always want to make sure that we are giving the people who are watching that emotional cadence of, okay, this is a time when the players are feeling like this, or they're really hoping for this, anticipating this, or they're really dreading this. And then when the things that they are hoping for happen, it's this high point of, this was a huge achievement for them, or relief, or whatever it is. Like all of those things that keep us hooked on the game when we're playing, I think are very important to kind of convey on a broadcast.
Oh, I love that idea, and I love that you get to capture celebrating victories and I guess I don't know if celebrating is the right word for the bad beats, but like living in that moment too, like bringing viewers into that experience.
Right. And I think it's one of those things, right, where it's very easy, like on the bad beats, it's very easy, I think, to skate over that kind of thing. And we're always very sympathetic. Like I'm
Yeah.
very, very strongly believe that casters should be, we're sympathetic. We try to make the players look good. We, don't criticize them. We really try and bring out why they're doing something. But sometimes, things happen, especially on arena, like the auto tapper, right? That's a classic
Oh
example.
yeah, yeah.
And we've seen matches won and lost at extremely high stakes because of auto tapper. And it's just one of those things where you think, oh, and the players just thinking, oh, and I just want the audience to like, it's okay, this happens to everyone. We've all been there. We can all experience that. And that kind of empathetic connection between the player and the audience is something that I care about a lot.
Oh yeah. Well, you always hate to see a client be the cause of something like that, of course. But
Right.
one of my earliest memories of playing Magic Online as a young player was accidentally clicking through the declare blocker step when I had a flash creature to flash in to prevent lethal damage.
Oh.
And I remember messaging my opponent on the client like, "Hey, I have this flash creature. Can you just not attack?" And they were like, "No, no." Like,
No, what are you talking about?
so I have a fair bit of sympathy for those sorts of things happening from the very beginning.
Oh, Magic Online is a whole thing. The learning curve of Magic Online is wild. I always tell people who are thinking about picking it up, I'm like, I spent the first 3 months just skipping my combat step entirely. like I
Pro plays, pro
I
plays.
don't know how. It's just so easy to skip the combat step. And then recently, of course, when the damage rule changed, that also messed me up a little
Oh
bit
yeah.
when I first played. I was like, I think it's just so easy to click through too many times when you're expecting a step that doesn't appear. So yeah, I mean, online Magic has very weird quirks, and it's very interesting because when you watch the arena championships, especially people playing the highest stakes of arena. The skills that these players have with the stops and the bluffs and the not only stopping to bluff but like clicking through quickly to make it look like they don't have something, and like all the shenanigans, like it's very real and pretty insane when you actually think about like what they're doing, physically. I don't think of Magic as an APM game normally.
But yeah, it's so funny because they're the tells you would see in a face-to-face match. Like somebody may pick up their pen to move to their life pad to, try to bluff somebody into making decisions, like those sorts of things.
Mhm.
But I don't ever think about the online version of that. Clicking through priorities or something.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to come across it very often, but the top players, you know.
Well, to that end, you have a background in playing as well. How does casting impact your experience as a player?
I think it definitely helps. Like, I love Magic, I love playing Magic, and I like competitive Magic for sure. I would not describe myself as having any significant results in my life. But, I think that part of casting is, and especially the job that I do, which is like the play by play, and that's talking through the action. It's kind of analogous to sports broadcasting, talking through the action, but making sure the show's going at the pace that we want it to go at, and we're highlighting things that's important. And something that does teach you is to have this kind of overview of what's happening. So you're not really just in the moment, but you're kind of thinking about what came before and where the action is going next. And I think that that's something that has helped me a lot in playing as well, because I think a lot of the time when we're in a game and we're kind of trying to make those decisions ourselves, we can get very caught up in agonizing about what do I do in this particular spot, right? And I'm sure most of your listeners are probably better than me, but like for me, one of the problems that I really had a lot was kind of just thinking about what can I do now, or what's the best thing to do right now, and not necessarily thinking about what came before this, what does that say about what my
Mm,
opponent's doing, where does my opponent see this game going, where should I be seeing this game going, like what turn am I winning on, those kind of questions that help you a lot if you take a bit of a step back.
that is really great. Kind of thinking of the game in a holistic sense. And I don't know if so many players have that as a default posture of what is my opponent thinking or where are they thinking we're going? That's a great question.
Right. I mean, it's the classic who's the beatdown, right? But it's kind of the more developed version of it, in that it's not just who's the beatdown, it's should I be the beatdown? Like, should my opponent be the beatdown? Are either of us correct in thinking that we're the beatdown? What's happening here?
I will say that should I be the beatdown just doesn't have the same ring to it, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely true.
For those of us who are not as well versed in the terminology sometimes, when you talk about play-by-play commentary, is what's the corollary to that, or what would you expect your partner in the booth to cover?
Right. So play by play is kind of generally the person who is introducing the match and probably introducing the players, kind of setting the scene. And then as the match happens, we're kind of calling the shots, right? Like calling the action of what's happening currently, what the players are doing. And then our co-caster, who is usually the expert, they're usually going to be a competitive player who has played a lot of Magic, played in a lot of events, has good results, and they're the ones who are going to bring the insights. So generally, the way to think about it is a play-by-play is kind of covering what's happening, and the expert is covering why. And usually, what they're doing is kind of really getting into the heads of the players and telling us like why they decided to make this decision, what's in their heads, like what their plan is, how their lines can play out in the next few turns. And so the relationship between the two is very important, because if you let your expert just go off and talk about lines the whole time, you can miss the actual stuff that's happening on the board. But
Mm.
also, you need a little bit of that to kind of elevate the broadcast and help people kind of think a bit more critically about what the players are doing, and really give that strategic insight. Because a lot of the time when you see great players play, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Like a lot, that sounds weird to say. But if you watch some of the best players in the world play, the decisions that they make are so not obvious sometimes that
Yeah.
you really need someone to explain, like, why have they done this very not obvious thing, right? And there's always a reason, and the reason is always kind of wild. And then the most satisfying thing is seeing that play out, like seeing them have this plan that is entirely beyond anything you could think of, and then it over the next few turns it plays out exactly the way that they thought it would, and then it's just fantastic. The example I always give for this is Seth Manfield, because he's just, every time I watch him play or do take any game actions, I'm like, why are you doing any of this? Right? And then
He's a
he just always
master.
wins.
Master.
So I don't know. He must be doing something right.
I feel like it's kind of like trying to explain a magic trick that's in process. Like, like, not with magic cards, I suppose, but one of those things where, okay, we're doing this thing that you're not going to see the result of right away, maybe, and then the shocking conclusion at the end that your team will see that the listener may not.
Right. Yeah, that is really, I think, the core of the job that we do and why we do it, that we really love and really appreciate these plays and these decisions. And the reason I actually got into magic and competitive magic and casting was that at the very beginning of my magic journey, when I first started learning to play, like I barely even knew how to play. Like I kind of just knew the rules and had played a few games, at home, and then I just started watching Pro Tour broadcasts. I spent like 3 months maybe watching just every YouTube Pro Tour broadcast video that was available. And I like didn't know what non-basic lands were. you know?
That's
And,
awesome.
and I just remember like Gabby, Marshall and BDM and all the
Oh
greats,
yeah,
back then just saying,
Rich
just
Hagen.
talking,
Yeah.
Rich Hagen, Randy, and then like, and Gabby, I just always can remember Gabby's voice in my head going like, and here comes Anna Fenza. And I'm like, who is Anna Fenza? What is Anna Fenza? I have no idea. Um, and
That's awesome.
and that's what kind of really what got me into it because I love watching people excel at something. Like I love watching people be really, really good at something. And part of the job I think of broadcasting is to help everyone understand like how it is that these players are better than the rest of them, how they've made it to this spot where they're playing for hundreds of $1,000s or they're playing for a world championship invite or whatever it is.
And now you're part of that pantheon as well that are bringing people along into the experience.
I hope so. I hope so.
So beyond casting at CubeCon, you also got to bring a cube of your own to that event.
Yes, so I will say first of all that I actually did not quote unquote bring the cube because, and huge shout out to Brian Koval, to BK, who insisted that he would make the cube for me because I did not have time beforehand to kind of acquire all the cards. And I said, "Oh, I don't think I can bring it. I'm really sorry." And he was like, "No, well, we'll get all the cards for you." So massive shout out to BK and the CubeCon crew for putting that together.
Absolutely, shout out to BK.
But yeah, my cube is called Oops All Pips. And the gimmick, if you will, in it is that there's no generic mana, kind of.
No generic mana asterisk.
Yeah, it's all pips, kind of.
Oops, all pips is delightful. In looking through the list, and it is, as the name suggests, leaning very heavily on colored mana pips. One of my favorite things about it, as you described it in your overview on Cube Cobra, you say that you've built a cube that asks players to figure out how to make greed work for them. What is that? What do you mean by that, and how did you work to achieve that?
First of all, I'm not 100% sure I've achieved that yet, but maybe, well, we'll see. The reason I really kind of made this cube was that it'd been in my mind a long time because I have always loved mana pips and I've always thought that it's such a cool way to like regulate how easy or difficult it is to play a spell, right? I think one of those mechanics that is so core to Magic that we all just take it for granted. But if you look at the card designs, like the difference between how easy it is to cast Counterspell and how easy it is to cast Negate is like wild,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Like
night
your
and day.
whole
Night and
deck
day.
has to change in order to be able to do one and do the other. And so, like we were talking about before, I played a lot of limited when I first started out. And when you first start playing limited, people tell you should build a 2-color deck, and if you want to splash one card in a third color, you need 3 sources. It's very. But I started about Amonkhet. One of the first sets I played was Hour of Devastation. And that was
Oh yeah.
the first limited set that I really fell in love with. I think that was really like when I fell in love with Magic as a whole. And just the card Oasis Ritualist was just my favorite card in the whole set because it meant that I could play whatever I wanted. on the splash because it
That's
would make you
right.
a double pip for you. And realizing that and understanding, like, unlearning what you can do, what you can't do, what you can get away with, and what you can't get away with was a whole process because just put, I would just stretch mana bases way beyond what is sensible.
And that was so brave in Hour of Devastation too, because you had all the exert things going on in the front end that were trying to beat face. But if you were able to get to that point where you could cast all the huge 5 color things, you were having a grand old time.
Right. I mean, first of all, if you play a 2/4, a lot of those things aren't killing you.
That's true. That's very true.
It was just the classic River Hoopu, um,
Oh man.
Oasis Ritualist, and then yeah, at the top end there was like some crocodiles
Oh yeah.
that were great.
You're speaking my language here, Haiyue. Sandworm Convergence was perhaps my favorite rare in that set.
Mm,
Or I guess for Amonkhet particularly. But yeah, you could just top out with these huge things that made all those aggressive cards much less exciting.
yeah, for sure. And that was a great set. I mean, the fact that you could play green white aggro and green white ramp in the same limited format, I think just shows like how great and deep that one was. And even now to this day, like the formats that I love the most do tend to be the ones where you can kind of go all out. Like the Cowdimes, Neon Dynasty, March of the Machine, the kind of more formats where it's just easier to do the soupy crazy things.
Do you feel like the Ravnica sets scratch that itch for you?
I am not the okay. I loved Guilds of Ravnica, but then I really didn't get on with Ravnica Allegiance, and I don't know why. Like, and didn't really get to play the older Ravnica sets. Although a lot of the guild mages are great cube cards, I will say.
Oh yeah.
And they have pips, so they're great cube cards with oops or pips.
No, I was just curious, in a set that's designed around colors and trying to keep people into particular lanes, I didn't know if that was something that, you saw as an open door rather than a restriction.
It is possible that some of the reason I didn't love it as much was because I felt like we were being told to do one thing or another. Like, I think for me, a great example of a multicolor set is Streets of New Capenna. And this is again controversial because everyone hates Streets of New Capenna Unlimited because the draft was bad. But me and 499 other people loved playing sealed deck of Streets of New Capenna on Magic Online. Um, and the sealed format was incredible. Like, it was just everything that I wanted a multicolor format to be, where you could be in your 3 colors, but then it was easy to splash. The treasures were great. Like, it wasn't as fast as draft, so you weren't kind of just dead to white 2 drops the whole time. And so yeah, I love a lot of the stuff they've been doing in recent times with things like making treasures more easily accessible in all colors, for example. Like, I think that's a great thing that happens in more recent Magic design, I think.
So do you take elements like treasures or anything from Streets of New Capenna to apply to a project like this?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of cards like that are part of the cube and that I love. I think a great example is the equipment Beamtown Beatstick. It's just red for an equipment that gives +1/+0 menace, and whenever the creature deals combat damage to a player or a battle, create a treasure. That's only from Martin Maltese, but I think that was like Sticky Fingers was the first iteration of that, and it's the Aura, and that's also in the cube, by the way. And that's from Streets of New Capenna. And I like challenges in limited. Like, I like the idea of you can have this reward of doing something cool or off the wall or splashier or greedier, but you have to work for it. And that's kind of what the cube is trying to be about.
So there's an anecdote that sticks in my mind from a friend of yours that was talking about, I believe it was at CubeCon, where they got to cast Galvanic Iteration into Villainous Wealth. So,
Yeah. Well, so that
so
was actually my friend Elaine, who's a great judge, and we were having dinner the night before. The funniest thing is we were having dinner the night before, right? And she's saying, and this was before the event started. She was saying, I saw your cube. I don't really get it. Like, I don't. What's the point of this? And And then the next day, she finds she's like, "Oh, I just cast galvanic into villainous while the x equals 7 or something." I was like, "Well, there you go. You've answered your question."
But there's got to be something really satisfying about somebody saying, I don't get it, into something wild like that.
Yeah, it was really satisfying. I wasn't really sure if it would work. I did some drafts of it in my Discord server. I made a lot of changes. Like it had gone through quite a few different revisions before going to KubeCon, but it was still kind of a big unknown for me because we hadn't seen that many drafts of it, and it was just I was just worried that people would not have playable decks, or just the usual worries I'm sure that cube creators have. But yeah, ultimately I did talk to a lot of people who drafted it. It fired quite a few times, and I actually got to look at a lot of the decklist pictures on Hedron Archive afterwards to kind of see what did well and what didn't. And a lot of these decks look exactly like the kind of decks I was hoping that people would draft. So I'm pretty happy.
Oh, that has to be so satisfying. I mean, I think I could surmise the answer based on what you've already shared, but with huge multicolor piles being something that's often panned by cube designers, are 4 and 5 color decks something that you are trying to encourage here?
Definitely, yes. Well, I think what I wanted was for 5 color decks to be viable and good, but not necessarily be the only or best thing to do. And I think that's difficult to manage. In the original conception of this cube, by the way, I had this idea that everyone was going to start with a chromatic lantern.
Oh my goodness.
That obviously didn't happen because as soon as I spoke to literally anyone about it, they said that is the worst idea I've ever had.
Hey, what are friends for?
Right. Um, but having a look at the list that did well, I will say that something that I was a little bit worried about maybe did happen, which is that I was worried that the supported mono color archetypes were going to be a little strong. So I think mono black and mono green are probably the most supported. And I do see a lot of 3Os with mono black and mono green, but even so, they're not really fully mono. Like a lot of them have splashes. A lot of them are like mono black splash cruel ultimatum. You know?
Splash Cruel Ultimatum is a wild.
Uh-huh. Stuff like that. And all I can say is I'm happy that people had fun.
With mana pips being so important, how challenging is it to choose cards that fit into this kind of environment?
Yeah, it was tough. First of all, it was hard even to narrow down the Scryfall search. Like I had to tweet somebody at Scryfall and to explain what I needed, and they came back to me with like a sentence, like a script, like a piece of code. I'm not a coder, but it was a very long search function which I have kind of bookmarked somewhere just to get Scryfall to only show the cards that only have pips. And then it still has archetypes, so I really try to kind of put in the archetypes that I love into it, which is definitely not just 6 different kinds of aristocrats.
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Definitely not. Couldn't be me. But it was, I think a lot of the cards that I ended up cutting were cards that I really wanted to work, but just they were more funny than good, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's something I've heard from a lot of different designers at different times where like there's this clever thing that goes along with the theme of the cube, and then there comes a point where it's like, well, that just doesn't play the way I expect it to.
Right. And for example, I really at one point had this idea that I would put a lot of kind of 1 mana auras in it and have this kind of daybreak coronet thing going, and it just did not work out. Like it was just way too difficult to do. I don't know why, but it was like I had a lot of what I felt like were good auras, but then it turned out that in order to make that archetype work, you needed just so much support for it that it just made everything else kind of out of kilter.
Yeah, and Daybreak Coronet is one of those that's so polarizing. When it works, it's such a house.
Right, exactly. And then when it doesn't work, you're like, why is this card does literally nothing?
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can't even cast it.
Right. So yeah, that was definitely, one of the things that ended up getting cut pretty early. And then the other thing was just to resist, I had to resist a lot of just putting too many 3 and 4 color cards in. Well, mostly the 3 color cards. Because I love 3 color cards. And I always thought, okay, if I just put a bunch of 3 color cards in, people will be able to splash them, etc. But I think that's one of the ways that it's very easy to go down this like everything's going to be soup route is if you're supporting splashing and then you also put a bunch of really great 3 and 4 color cards in.
Yeah. Well, I think that leads into that really nicely. How did you come to the mana base that you chose to use here? Because again, mana matters a lot here.
Yeah, that's a great question. How did that happen? So, okay, so joking aside, the first build of this cube had 2 sets of filter lands in it. And then after testing it out a bit, it turned out that we actually didn't need 2 sets of filters. And that was also roughly the time that the Surveil lands came
Oh
in.
yeah. One of the best land cycles of the last decade for sure.
Yes, absolutely. I think maybe my favorite of all time. So those obviously had to go straight in. And then oh, there's some stuff that I just fully didn't forgot to take out of this build, by the way. Like, I'm just gonna admit to this right now. Do not take the card Faceless Haven in this cube. Like I don't know how it got in there. I don't know. I think at some point I was really hoping to do like a mask with Nexus stuff. I don't know. Um, that should not be in there.
Hayu, I think that that may have unintentionally been a huge encouragement to so many other designers of like, hey, this happens to everyone.
um, and and literally the same friend, the same villainous lost friend, also was like, but I also why is Faceless Haven here? I literally cannot activate this, and I was like, oh no, oops. um,
Well, I mean, it does have all pips in fairness.
right, exactly. It's on theme. Yeah, so the only card that there's 2 copies of is Cascading Cataracts, because I think that as an effect that is pretty fair, like it costs 1 more than it produces
Right?
technically, and it does solve a lot of problems. But I didn't want for everyone to be able to get one very easily either. So there's just 2 copies of that in there, and then everything else, I think I kind of just winged it. Is that a bad answer to this
No.
question?
Well, if it's a true answer, it's not a bad answer.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, the only cards in the cube that have generic mana are the mana rocks because I couldn't really get away from that.
Yeah, I was going to make sure we at least touched on the asterisk of all pips except.
Yeah, right, exactly. Except the mana rocks. And it was also pretty interesting trying to choose the mana rocks. Like I definitely thought that signets were more on theme, for example, than talismans. But I also didn't want to go too hard. So there's some stuff that I love, like Cultivator's Caravan, is just one of the mana lists of all time.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, you did mention your love for vehicles early on.
yeah, I do. I do love vehicles. And there's also a bunch of cards in here that are just cards that I personally think are neat. um, you
Insert
know,
the Marge Simpson meme here.
right.
I just think they're neat.
And also, but there's also some stuff. So, like the one of the asterisks are the X spells. So, like X spells are kind of a theme in the cube, not just villainous wealth, but there's a bunch of hydras and there's some kind of support for the archetype as well. And oh, that was again one of the early cuts, by the way. Walking Ballista, way too strong.
Yeah, it turns out pretty
Yeah.
good.
That card messed up. Don't put that in your oops or pips. You gotta be greedy deck.
X is not all pips. If that in that case, don't do that one.
Right, for sure.
No, it sounds like those are the sorts of things that, like you were mentioning, having to cut other things because they didn't play as well as you had hoped. That this is the sort of thing that may just be needed in an environment like this. Things like the X spells or some of these, a few
Right.
colorless enablers. It's just something that's necessary for the environment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that, you've got to try and balance out the thing you're doing and the actual playability of the cube. Again, this cube has, there've been maybe 10 or 12 drafts of it, so it's not like I'm very well developed in it, and there's probably a lot of work that needs to be done. to it. But I think that you've got to try and put some stuff in that's like, even if the thing that you're doing isn't working out, there's got to be a plan B. If you can find like a splash in another color that has an X and it's XX and a pip, and that's like the only card you can draw that you can play. Like, you need something, right? You need something to be able to save those games that would otherwise just be non-games.
So, Haiyue, what have you learned about Cube broadly as you've worked on this project?
First of all, I learned that it's very hard to make a cube. um, I don't think I knew before this how hard it was to make a cube. The first cube I ever played was a one drop cube, which interestingly also actually ended up covering a one drop cube at CubeCon, which was Wheeler's one drops. And
Yes.
Ben Wheeler was actually drafting it also, and unsurprisingly won the pod. But like, thinking back to that first time I played a cube, and I just thought, oh, maybe they just found a bunch of cards that cost one, And I didn't really think how much it was about the context of how these cards are going to play against each other, what the power level is, what the outliers are, what's going to be too good, what's going to be not good enough, what's more funny than good, all of that stuff. So there's a lot that goes into it. And the other thing I learned was that it's good to get advice and to get people to play it and kind of get their feedback, but also ultimately you have to be driving it. Like, you have to have the reins on it, and you can't possibly listen to everybody because everyone's going to have different opinions, different takes, especially if they've only drafted it once or twice. The views that people have, it doesn't matter how experienced they are or how good at cube they are, good at magic they are. I mean, some of the advice they give is going to be great, but the advice that they give is going to be based on their experiences, which is going to be a small sample of the times people draft the cube, etc. So I am somewhat of a people pleaser sometimes. So I always, when people give me advice to do this or that, I always think, oh, I've got to follow it. I've got to change it this way or that way. But I think there's something to be said for having a vision and being like, okay, I will take this advice and I'll try to maybe moderate some of the excesses or maybe shore up some of the places that are most obviously problematic. But ultimately, you can't fix every problem and you can't please everybody. So you've got to try and stick to the thing that you think makes the cube special as well.
That's excellent. One other thing I wanted to make sure we cover before we wrap up here, working with KubeCon certainly means you got to work closely with the team behind the project. How was that?
Yeah, I mean, CubeCon was really a one of a kind show. I think it was unlike anything any of us had ever done before. Our producer, behind the scenes director, they were like pros who'd done broadcast for years, and they were also saying this show is like nothing we've ever done before. There were so many aspects that went into it that were very, very unique. Not only the cubes and all the logistics that come with that, but the matches, the cards, the location, just everything. And so in that process, we worked very closely with the CubeCon team. We already mentioned BK, but I did, of course, also want to mention JBro, who was obviously just everywhere, kind of coordinating all of the efforts. And we could tell how passionate he was about Cube and the community in particular. And he just really wanted to make sure that everyone who went to CubeCon had a great time, and participated. I think he was very insistent, for example, that the influencers who came to CubeCon were not just kind of doing meet and greets, but they were actually playing and not participating. And I thought that was something that was very special. And I think it was a success. Lots of tributes have been made to J-Bro. Really, for me, like the greatest mark of his success was that every single person I spoke to at CubeCon was having a fantastic time. The vibes were excellent, and nobody really had really very few people had like those bad beats or whatever stories that you often get at big tournaments, and it was a long event, 4 whole days. I think people who made it to the top eight played something like 20 something rounds. Maybe I'm making that up,
Yeah.
but that
Oh
sounds
no,
like a
no.
lot. But it was a lot of magic, you know.
No, you're right. It was. I think if you made it to the finals, and you played the preview event, you were playing 21 rounds over 4 days.
Right, and that's a lot of magic to be playing, and despite that, everyone was just so happy, and it was an awesome event, very unique. So, and all of that, of course, is thanks to kind of the vision that Jabra and BK had when they founded KubeCon. So, big shout out to both of them. And of course, our thoughts are still with Jabra's family and friends.
Absolutely. Well, Hayu, as we trend toward wrapping up here, I get to ask you one of my favorite questions, which is if you could have any card printed as a promo, what card would you choose and who would you have do the illustration?
Okay, well, my favorite card is Sublime Epiphany. It's just, I love counter spells. I'm unashamedly one of those people. Every set that comes out, people get excited about the rares or mythics or whatever. I get excited about what cantrips they gave us and which upgraded version of cancel we're getting this time.
Yes.
And, um, and so yeah, I love Sublime Epiphany. I think that the original art on it is already awesome, but I will say that I think Rebecca Goy is the best magic artist of all time, and I just love everything that she's done. So that would be my pick.
That's excellent. Well, Hayu, this has been a delight. I so appreciate you sharing your expertise and your passion for what you've been working on. If folks want to follow up with you or they want to follow some of the things you're working on, where would be the best place for us to point them?
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm on Blue Sky and on Twitter. I will say that I check Blue Sky more than Twitter these days. And in both places, if you search for Nifette, Niphettete, you will be able to find me.
Well, thank you so much again. This was an absolute treat for me, and perhaps we'll have opportunities to connect at events here in the future, whether remotely through casting or perhaps in person.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Kate. This was lovely.